Hi.
It wasn't any single event that tipped me off, but 1,000 tiny shifts that, together, became impossible to ignore. Sarah and I had been married for 10 years, and while it was far from perfect, I'd always thought we were a good team. We built a life that was both predictable and fulfilling. A house in the suburbs, a couple of golden retrievers, and enough shared memories to paper over any cracks in the foundation. But something had changed. It began with her phone. It used to sit casually on the coffee table or kitchen counter, often buzzing with messages from her work group chats, or the occasional meme from her best friend, Kelly. I never paid much attention because I never had a reason to. But then she started keeping it close, too close. It became an extension of her, always within reach, always with the screen turned away. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Everyone's a little more attached to their devices these days, right? But then there were the late-night texts. I'd glance over, bleary-eyed, from the couch or our bed to see her furiously typing, her face lit by the glow of the screen. When I asked who it was, she'd brush it off with a vague, just work stuff. Sarah was an attorney, after all, and long hours were part of the job. But something about the way she said it felt off. Too casual, too rehearsed. The changes didn't stop there. She started going out more. Networking events or team dinners that always seemed to crop up at the last minute. She'd leave the house in outfits that were a little too polished, her makeup a touch more dramatic than her usual understated look. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who questioned her every move, so I bit my tongue. I told myself that maybe she was just throwing herself into her work, climbing the corporate ladder with a determination I had always admired. But admiration started to turn into unease. There was one evening I'll never forget. We were sitting down to dinner, a rare occurrence these days, and I reached for her hand across the table. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her phone buzzed, and she flinched, pulling her hand away to check the screen. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it felt like a slap in the face. "You're distracted lately?" I said, trying to keep my tone light. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't realized I was paying attention. "Work's just been a lot," she said quickly, her eyes darting back to her plate. It was a plausible excuse, one I might have believed if it weren't for the gnawing feeling in my gut. The distance between us grew in ways that were both subtle and glaring. She stopped asking about my day, stopped sharing details about hers. Our conversations, once filled with inside jokes and shared dreams, had dwindled to logistical exchanges about grocery lists and dog grooming appointments. Even our silences, which had once been comfortable, now felt suffocating. I found myself clinging to the routines that remained, hoping they would tether us to the life we'd built. Weekend hikes with the dogs, movie nights on Fridays, the lazy Sunday mornings we used to cherish. But even those began to fade. Sarah always had a reason to be somewhere else: errands, a yoga class, a coffee meeting with a colleague. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday. We had planned to spend the day cleaning out the garage. A mundane task, but one I'd been looking forward to as an excuse to spend time together. That morning, she announced she had a work meeting and left without so much as a backward glance. I spent the day alone, the rain drumming against the roof as I sifted through boxes of old photographs and souvenirs. I found one from our honeymoon. A picture of us standing on a cliff in Santorini, the sun setting behind us. Sarah's arm was looped through mine, her head resting on my shoulder, her smile radiant. I stared at the photo for a long time, wondering where that version of us had gone. By the time she came home, it was late. She smelled faintly of wine and unfamiliar cologne. "Long day," she said, dropping her bag by the door and heading upstairs without another word. I didn't follow her. Instead, I sat in the darkened living room, the photo still in my hand, feeling the weight of a truth I wasn't ready to face. Over the next few weeks, the signs became impossible to ignore. There were the carefully curated excuses, the phone calls she took outside, the nights she came home later and later. And then there was the undeniable change in her demeanor, lighter, almost giddy at times, as if she were carrying a secret too exciting to contain. I started paying closer attention. When she said she had dinner plans with a colleague, I checked her location on the Find My app. We'd both forgotten we had synced to our phones. She was nowhere near the restaurant she'd mentioned. Instead, she was parked in a residential neighborhood, her car idling for hours. I didn't confront her that night. I wasn't ready. Instead, I sat with the knowledge, letting it simmer, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to believe I was imagining things, that the cracks in our marriage were just the normal wear and tear of a decade together. But the other part of me, the part that couldn't ignore the tightening knot in my stomach, knew better. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning. I was getting ready for work when I noticed her laptop sitting open on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but the screen lit up with a notification just as I walked by. It was a message from someone named Mark. Looking forward to tonight. Can't stop thinking about you. My blood ran cold. I sat down, staring at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The evidence was right there, undeniable and damning. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Rage, heartbreak, and a sick kind of relief that my suspicions were finally confirmed. For a long time, I just sat there, the message glowing on the screen like a neon sign pointing to the end of everything I thought I knew. When Sarah came downstairs, I had already closed the laptop. She kissed me on the cheek, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Have a good day," she said, her tone light and breezy. As I watched her walk out the door, I made a decision. If she thought she could keep her secrets, she was wrong. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. First, I needed a plan. Suspicion may start as a whisper, but once it finds its voice, it becomes deafening. After seeing Mark's message on Sarah's laptop, the part of me that still wanted to believe in us faltered. Her betrayal, once a shapeless dread, now had a name, a time, and a location. My world, carefully constructed over a decade, had begun to collapse. But in that rubble, I found something unexpected. Clarity. If I confronted Sarah then and there, what would I gain? Her denials? Lies spun so intricately I might doubt what I knew to be true? No, I needed more. Not to convince myself I already knew, but to take control of the narrative. If she had chosen to rewrite our story, I'd be the one to decide how it ended. Over the next few days, I became a man with a purpose. My anger was a fire that sharpened rather than consumed me. I'd always been the laid-back one in our marriage, the steady rock, as Sarah used to call me. But now, every ounce of that steadiness turned into quiet determination. My first step was subtle. Observation. Sarah had grown so accustomed to my trust that she barely noticed my presence anymore. I started keeping a mental log of her comings and goings, the time she left for work, the time she returned, her excuses for late nights or sudden errands. Each inconsistency added weight to the case I was building. Her phone was next. If Mark's name appeared on her laptop, it must be on her phone as well. The challenge was getting access. Sarah had recently added a passcode, a move she'd explained as a security measure after a coworker had their phone hacked. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it felt like another barrier she'd erected between us. Opportunity struck late one evening. Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch, her phone balanced precariously on the armrest. The glow of the screen revealed her passcode as she absent-mindedly unlocked it earlier. A pattern of numbers I'd seen her tap a dozen times before. My hands shook as I keyed it in. It worked. Her messages were a goldmine. There were dozens from Mark, some innocuous, others dripping with the kind of familiarity that turned my stomach. They spoke in shorthand, their words layered with hidden meaning that only they understood. Worse were the pictures. A snapshot of them at some rooftop bar, her leaning into him, the city lights blurred behind them like a romantic postcard. The timestamps matched nights she told me she was working late. I'd always heard that catching a cheater brings closure. Instead, it brought something far colder. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, my heart beating out a rhythm I couldn't control. Still, I forced myself to take screenshots of everything. Evidence was my weapon, and I intended to wield it carefully. It wasn't enough to know she was lying. I needed to see it. So, I began tracking her movements, starting with the location-sharing app we had set up years ago during a road trip. She probably thought I'd forgotten it existed. Most of the time, her location pinged at places that matched her excuses. Her office, the gym, the grocery store. But every few days, a pin would appear in an unfamiliar area. A quiet residential street about 15 minutes from our house. I'd driven there once, under the pretense of running errands. The street was lined with modest homes, each one almost indistinguishable from the next. I parked a few houses down from where her car sat and waited. My patience was rewarded when I saw her emerge from one of the houses, laughing as Mark held the door open for her. They kissed before she got in her car, the kind of kiss that told me this wasn't new. This was their routine. I followed her once more, this time to a hotel. My stomach churned as I parked across the street, watching her check in with Mark by her side. Their ease with each other was what struck me most. They acted like a couple who had nothing to hide, and in that moment, I realized that I had been reduced to a shadow in my own life, a bystander to their affair. The next phase of my plan involved digging into Mark. Who was this man who had so casually inserted himself into my marriage? A quick internet search revealed the basics. He was a marketing executive, divorced, with 2 kids who lived out of state. His social media was curated to perfection. Photos of him hiking, dining at upscale restaurants, attending charity galas. He projected an image of sophistication, the kind that I could see Sarah being drawn to. But his online life wasn't spotless. Buried among the polished posts were traces of another side. A blog from years ago hinted at financial troubles during his divorce. A series of tagged photos showed him at questionable parties with women half his age. None of it surprised me, but it painted a clearer picture of the man who had stolen my wife. My most valuable find, however, came from a chance encounter. A mutual acquaintance, unaware of my connection to Mark, mentioned him at a neighborhood barbecue. "That guy's trouble," they said, recounting a story about Mark's workplace affair that had nearly cost him his job. It was enough to confirm what I already suspected. Mark wasn't just a temporary fling. He was a serial cheater, a man who thrived on deception. By the time I had gathered all the evidence, weeks had passed. Sarah seemed blissfully unaware of my investigation, her lies flowing as easily as ever. She'd grown bolder, even flaunting her late nights with the excuse that she needed time to decompress. Each excuse was like fuel on a fire I was carefully controlling. I began planning the confrontation. This wasn't just about exposing her. It was about reclaiming the power she had stripped from me. My goal wasn't to scream or cry or plead. It was to make her face the consequences of her actions in a way she couldn't ignore. My first step was to contact a private investigator. While I had gathered plenty of evidence on my own, I wanted a professional's touch. The investigator captured high-quality photos and videos of Sarah and Mark, documenting their meetings with a precision I couldn't achieve alone. The files were neatly organized into a folder, ready to be presented when the time came. Next, I set up a meeting with a divorce attorney. I wasn't ready to file yet, not until I confronted Sarah, but I wanted to know my options. The attorney was blunt but compassionate, outlining the steps I'd need to take to protect myself financially and emotionally. I left the meeting feeling a strange mix of dread and empowerment. The night before I planned to confront Sarah, I found myself sitting in our living room, surrounded by the ghosts of our life together. Photos of vacations, birthdays, and anniversaries lined the walls, each one a testament to the life we had built. I felt a pang of sorrow for the man I had been. A man who had believed in forever, who had trusted so completely that he never saw the cracks forming beneath his feet. But sorrow gave way to resolve. By this time tomorrow, Sarah's carefully constructed facade would come crashing down. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. The day of the confrontation arrived with a strange stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I woke up before the sun, my mind clear and sharp in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Everything I needed was prepared: the evidence, the plan, and the resolve to see it through. Sarah had no idea that the comfortable bubble she'd created was about to burst. She left for work as usual, her usual routine of a breezy kiss on the cheek and a quick goodbye. I watched her drive away, the image of her disappearing down the street etched into my mind. For a moment, doubt crept in. I questioned whether I was doing the right thing and if there was any part of me that still wanted to salvage what we had. But then, the memories of the late nights, the lies, and the betrayal pushed away those doubts. The man who had once questioned his instincts no longer existed. In his place was someone who demanded the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. That afternoon, I set the plan in motion. The private investigator's folder of evidence, photos, timestamps, and detailed accounts of Sarah's meetings with Mark was copied onto a USB drive. Key pieces were printed, with the most damning ones highlighted for effect. These weren't just for Sarah. They were also meant for Mark's wife, Elena, who had agreed to join me in confronting them. Elena and I had become unlikely allies in this twisted saga. Her anger mirrored mine, though her heartbreak seemed deeper, more raw. She had shared stories of her own suspicions, recounting the way Mark had started coming home late with vague excuses and an air of detachment. Initially hesitant to believe me when I first reached out, the evidence left no room for doubt. We decided to confront them together at the place they would least expect, the very hotel they'd been using for their rendezvous. The manager, once presented with the investigator's documentation, reluctantly agreed to assist us. He granted us access to the room they had reserved, allowing us to wait for their arrival. The hours leading up to the confrontation were surreal. Elena and I sat in the dimly lit hotel room, the air heavy with unspoken tension. She fiddled with her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger as though trying to make sense of its meaning. I stayed silent, focused on the folder in front of me. Despite barely knowing each other, we shared an understanding that only those united by betrayal could feel. Elena eventually broke the silence, asking whether they might try to deny everything. I reassured her that any attempt at denial would be futile against the mountain of evidence we had collected. She nodded, her determination solidifying as we prepared to face the moment. Sarah and Mark arrived in the early evening, their laughter echoing down the hall before the door opened. My heart pounded as the keycard beeped, and the door swung open to reveal them. Their smiles froze as they saw us sitting there. Sarah's eyes darted to mine, then to Elena, and finally to the folder on the table. Mark's expression shifted from confusion to panic as his hand tightened around the strap of his bag. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Sarah dropping her purse. It hit the floor with a dull thud, an eerie prelude to what was about to unfold. The atmosphere thickened as the weight of the situation settled over the room. The folder of evidence was placed before them, its contents laid bare. Photos of their meetings, screenshots of their messages, and receipts from their hotel stays formed a damning mosaic. Mark attempted to speak, his voice shaking with desperation as he turned to Elena, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. Sarah's expression crumbled as she turned her gaze to me, tears brimming in her eyes. They began to offer explanations, each one more desperate than the last. Sarah claimed that she had felt neglected and that the excitement of the affair had been a temporary escape. Mark insisted it was a mistake born out of weakness. Their words fell flat, devoid of true remorse. Neither seemed to grasp the depth of their betrayal or the damage they had caused. Elena unleashed her fury, directing it squarely at Mark. Her anger was raw and unfiltered, every word striking like a blow. Watching her, I felt an odd sense of detachment, as though I were observing from a distance. My own anger burned quieter, more controlled. I had said what I needed to say with the evidence. Now it was time to act. A manila envelope was handed to Sarah. Inside were divorce papers, pre-signed and ready to be filed. She stared at it as though it contained a bomb, visibly recoiling from the weight of its implications. She questioned whether this was truly the end, but I made it clear that her actions had already sealed our fate. With that, I stood and walked out, leaving behind the chaos and the echoes of shattered trust. Elena followed soon after, her silence speaking volumes. In the weeks that followed, the confrontation reverberated through our lives. Sarah moved out, her belongings packed neatly into boxes that sat in the garage like remnants of a life no longer ours. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had taken a leave of absence from work. Mark's life crumbled as well. Elena filed for divorce and ensured that his indiscretions became public knowledge, tarnishing his reputation. For me, the days were filled with paperwork and quiet reflection. The house felt emptier without Sarah, but it also felt lighter, as though a suffocating weight had been lifted. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that the confrontation, as painful as it had been, was not the end of my story. There was still life to be lived, and for the first time in weeks, I felt hope. The confrontation had shattered the facade of my marriage, but it was not the final act. As Sarah moved out and the remnants of our shared life were packed away, I found myself adrift. The clarity and resolve that had carried me through the confrontation gave way to a sense of emptiness. My house was quiet now, too quiet, and every empty room seemed to echo with the ghosts of what had been. But amidst the emptiness, something new began to take shape. A plan. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about reclaiming control, about ensuring that Sarah and Mark felt the weight of their actions in ways they could not ignore. While my life was already being rebuilt, I wanted them to feel the tremors of the collapse they had caused. This wasn't about malice. It was about balance. The first step was understanding Sarah's vulnerabilities. She was meticulous in her work and her reputation. Her career as an attorney built on an image of professionalism and competence. Mark, too, had carefully cultivated an outward persona, the charismatic marketing executive who charmed everyone in his orbit. Their relationship had thrived in secrecy, shielded by layers of lies and omissions. Exposing those layers would be the key. I began by reaching out to mutual acquaintances, people who might have noticed inconsistencies in Sarah's behavior but had dismissed them. I dropped hints in conversations, carefully planting seeds of doubt without revealing too much. Slowly, whispers began to circulate. Stories of Sarah's sudden absences, her unexplained phone calls, and her growing detachment started to surface. People who once admired her began to question her choices, their trust eroded by the same patterns I had come to recognize. Mark's professional world was more precarious. Through Elena, I learned that he had a history of workplace affairs, his charm often blinding people to his true nature. Armed with this knowledge, I discreetly contacted a former coworker who had been on the receiving end of Mark's manipulations. She was reluctant at first, wary of revisiting painful memories, but eventually agreed to share her story. Together, we crafted a detailed account that was both damning and irrefutable. Elena became an invaluable ally. While our connection had initially been born of shared pain, it evolved into a partnership built on mutual goals. She was relentless in her pursuit of justice, her resolve unshaken even as Mark tried to deflect blame and appeal to her emotions. Together, we compiled a dossier that left no room for denial. It included financial records showing hotel stays, message logs, and testimonies from those who had seen Mark's behavior firsthand. The next step was ensuring that this information reached the right people. I sent anonymous packages to Mark's employer, detailing his actions with supporting evidence. The goal wasn't to ruin him but to hold him accountable for the duplicity that had permeated both his personal and professional lives. Similarly, I shared key pieces of information with Sarah's firm, framing it as a concern about conflicts of interest. I knew the fallout wouldn't be immediate, but the seeds had been planted, and they would grow. Social media became another tool in my arsenal. Carefully curated posts hinted at the truth without overtly naming names. Photos from the confrontation, blurred enough to maintain anonymity but clear enough to tell a story, were shared with captions that spoke of betrayal and resilience. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in, alongside questions from those who had begun to piece together the details. The court of public opinion, as brutal as it could be, was now in motion. Sarah's reaction was swift. She called, her voice taut with anger and desperation, demanding to know why I was airing our private lives so publicly. I listened in silence, letting her words wash over me without response. Her guilt and indignation were a mirror of her choices, and I had no intention of offering her the closure she sought. Mark, too, reached out through mutual connections, his tone more calculated but no less transparent. Their attempts to regain control only fueled my determination. While orchestrating the plan, I had to confront my own emotions. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. I questioned whether I was becoming the very thing I despised, allowing bitterness to dictate my actions. But each time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the truth. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposing the lies, about ensuring that those who had taken so much from me understood the consequences of their actions. Friends and family became a crucial support system. They offered perspectives I couldn't see on my own, grounding me when my resolve wavered. My best friend, Matt, became my sounding board, his unflinching honesty a reminder of who I was before this ordeal. He helped me see that reclaiming my life wasn't just about tearing theirs apart. It was about finding freedom in the truth. As the weeks passed, the impact of my actions became evident. Sarah's firm launched an internal investigation, her position suddenly less secure. Mark faced scrutiny from his employer, his charm no longer enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions. The whispers I had started grew into a chorus, their once polished reputations now tarnished. Elena and I continued to share updates, our partnership a testament to resilience in the face of betrayal. She told me about the strength she had found through this process, the clarity that came from seeing Mark for who he truly was. Her divorce proceedings moved swiftly, her legal team armed with the evidence we had gathered. I felt a sense of pride in knowing that our efforts had given her the closure she deserved. Through it all, I discovered something unexpected. Peace. The anger that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. The confrontation and its aftermath had been a crucible, forging a new version of myself, one that was stronger, wiser, and unafraid to face the truth. On a cool autumn evening, I found myself standing at the edge of a lake, the water reflecting the fiery hues of the setting sun. In my hand was a letter I had written to Sarah, one that I would never send. It was a farewell, not just to her but to the life we had shared. As I watched the paper dissolve into the water, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The past no longer defined me. It was simply a part of my story, one that had shaped me but would not dictate my future. With the last traces of sunlight fading, I turned away from the lake, ready to step into the next chapter of my life. The plan had run its course, and now it was time to rebuild. Not out of spite or anger, but out of hope.
How was the video? Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave your comment. Thank you. Goodbye.